The biting cold of Manhattan sliced through the bustling city like a serrated blade. Winter's breath found every crack and corner, sending an unforgiving chill that seeped into even the thickest coats. The sidewalks were alive with hurried footsteps, a symphony of boots crunching against icy pavement. New Yorkers moved briskly, heads tucked low, collars raised against the merciless wind. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, bracing for something unspoken. Donald Trump, wrapped in a heavy black overcoat, stood out not because of who he was, though many heads would turn if they noticed, but because of the peculiar pace he maintained. Unlike the others rushing to escape the elements, he walked slowly, deliberately. Today was different. For reasons he couldn't quite articulate, he'd insisted on skipping the usual chauffeured route. There was something grounding about the city's rawness tonight, something he needed to feel for himself. As he turned off the main street into a dimly lit alley, the contrast was stark. Gone were the polished storefronts and brightly lit marquees, replaced with cold stone walls and the faint hum of fluorescent lights struggling to stay alive. It was here that his gaze settled on a solitary figure. Huddled against the wall, the man was a study in quiet desperation. His coat, frayed and faded, hung off his bony shoulders like an ill-fitted relic of a past life. It had once been elegant, a formal black that now bore the stains and scars of hard times. Around his neck hung a small silver cross, catching the pale light and glinting faintly against the darkness. A battered cardboard sign rested on the ground beside him, its message written in shaky but determined letters. "I used to be a priest. Now I need help." Trump stopped, his polished shoes crunching softly against the frost-covered ground. His security detail, never far behind, tensed but held their position as he raised a hand, signaling them to stay back. This was a moment meant for silence, not spectacle. The man, sensing a presence, lifted his head slowly. His face, hollowed by time and hardship, bore lines that spoke of both wisdom and weariness. His eyes, once perhaps a vibrant blue, were clouded with a mix of exhaustion and guarded hope. "Who are you?" the man rasped, his voice gravelly and strained, like the faint echo of a sermon long forgotten. Trump didn't answer immediately. He crouched down, leveling himself with the man, his gloved hands resting lightly on his knees. The wind swirled around them, carrying with it the muffled sounds of the city. "What's your name, Father?" Trump asked, his voice steady and low, carrying a weight of sincerity that seemed out of place amidst the cold indifference of the alley. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied the figure before him. There was something familiar about this man, but his mind, dulled by hunger and fatigue, couldn't quite place it. Still, the question had been asked with a gentleness he hadn't heard in years. After a moment, he answered. "Michael," he said, straightening slightly as if the act of speaking his name restored a fragment of his identity. "Father Michael." Trump nodded, his expression unreadable, though his eyes lingered on the silver cross. "Father Michael," he repeated, the words rolling off his tongue like a benediction. "How did you end up here?" Michael's gaze dropped to the ground, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his tattered coat. "I served the church for most of my life," he began, his voice tinged with a quiet resolve. 25 years, maybe more. But when the church closed its doors, when the congregation scattered, I lost everything. I tried to keep going, but without a place to preach, without a community. The world moves on. People forget. He paused, his hands now clasped tightly in his lap. I don't blame them. Everyone's got their struggles. But it's hard, you know? To go from being someone people look to for answers, for hope, to being invisible. For a moment, neither man spoke. The distant wail of a siren echoed through the alley, a reminder of the city's ceaseless rhythm. Trump let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He'd seen poverty before, on television, in reports, even during the campaign trail. But this was different. This was personal. "You're not invisible," Trump said finally, his voice firm. "Not to me." Michael looked up, startled by the conviction in those words. For the first time in years he felt seen, not as a charity case or a shadow among the forgotten, but as a person. There was a spark in Trump's eyes, a kind of determination that seemed almost out of place for a man of his stature. "I don't belong here," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a statement of defiance, but a quiet acknowledgement of a truth he'd buried beneath layers of shame and resignation. "No," Trump agreed. "You don't." He reached out, his gloved hand extended in a gesture that was both simple and profound. Michael stared at it, his mind racing with questions. Why would this man, a stranger, care? What did he want in return? But as he searched Trump's face, he found no ulterior motive, only a rare and unguarded sincerity. Slowly, hesitantly, Michael placed his hand in Trump's. The warmth of the gesture was startling against the cold air, a reminder that human connection could pierce even the darkest of winters. "Let's get you out of here," Trump said, helping Michael to his feet. As the two men stood, the cross around Michael's neck caught the light once more, casting a fleeting reflection against the alley wall. It was a small, fragile thing, but in that moment, it seemed to shine brighter than anything else in the city. The days passed in a haze of surreal disbelief for Father Michael. From the biting cold of a Manhattan alley to the warmth of a small, cozy hotel room, his world had shifted so quickly that he often found himself questioning if it was real. The room, modest but impeccably clean, had a single bed with crisp white sheets, a small wooden desk by the window, and a chair with cushions so soft that Michael often dozed off while sitting in it. Outside, the muted hum of the city filtered in, the world moving on as it always did. On a particularly pale winter morning, Michael sat by the window, watching people shuffle along the street below. Their hurried steps and bundled coats reminded him of his own solitude, but this time, it didn't feel oppressive. He sipped a steaming cup of tea, another small luxury he hadn't had in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something foreign, almost forgotten. Safety. It was on such a morning that Donald Trump arrived. The knock at the door startled Michael out of his thoughts. When he opened it, Trump stood there, dressed in his usual sharp suit, his coat draped neatly over one arm. Behind him, a member of his security team nodded politely before retreating to the hallway. "Good morning, Father Michael," Trump greeted with a faint smile, stepping inside. He carried a warmth that seemed at odds with his larger-than-life persona. Michael nodded, gesturing to the small table near the window. "Good morning. Please, have a seat." The two men sat across from each other, a pair of steaming coffee cups between them. Trump, ever the larger presence in any room, seemed uncharacteristically subdued, his focus entirely on Michael. "I'm glad to see you settling in," Trump said, his voice steady but tinged with something softer than Michael had expected. "It's been a lot to take in," Michael admitted. He cradled his coffee cup, his hands wrapped around it like it was a lifeline. "I'm grateful, but it feels strange. After so many years of scraping by, I don't know how to accept kindness without questioning it." Trump nodded thoughtfully, leaning back in his chair. "I get that. Life out there, it can make you suspicious, always waiting for the catch. But there isn't one here, Michael. Sometimes people just need a chance." Michael studied the man in front of him. He'd spent years helping others, guiding them through their struggles, but now he was the one in need of guidance. It was a humbling and uncomfortable realization. After a moment, Trump leaned forward, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "I want to do something for you," he began, his voice firm but measured. "Something more than just giving you a room or a few meals." Michael raised an eyebrow, his grip on the coffee cup tightening. "You've already done more than I could ever repay." "This isn't about repayment," Trump said, shaking his head. "It's about you, and people like you, People who've dedicated their lives to serving others, only to be forgotten when the world moves on. Michael's eyes flickered with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "What are you saying?" "I want to share your story," Trump said, his tone earnest. "The things you've done, the sacrifices you've made, the hardships you've faced. People need to hear it. They need to understand what it means to live a life of service, and what it costs." Michael stared into his coffee, his reflection rippling in the dark liquid. The idea of his life being put on display filled him with unease. "No one wants to hear it," he muttered. "What I've done, what I've lost, it should stay in the past." Trump's expression didn't waver. "That's where you're wrong. It's not just for them, it's for you. You've carried this burden alone for too long. Sharing it might not only help others, but also help you start healing." Michael looked up, his eyes meeting Trump's. In the man's gaze, he saw something he hadn't seen in years: belief, not just in a cause or a mission, but in him. It was unsettling, and yet strangely comforting. "What if they don't care?" Michael asked quietly. "What if it's just another sad story they forget by the next day?" Trump smiled faintly, his confidence unwavering. "Let them hear it anyway. Not everyone will care, but some will. And for those who do, your story could mean everything. It could remind them that even when life knocks us down, there's always hope." Michael sat back in his chair, his hands resting in his lap. For a long time he was silent, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. He thought about the countless people he'd counseled over the years, the lives he'd touched, and the lives he couldn't save. He thought about the church, now an empty shell, and the community that had once filled its pews. He thought about the long nights on the streets, when he'd prayed for a sign that he wasn't completely forgotten. "If this can help others," he said finally, his voice steady despite the weight of his words, "then I'll do it." Trump's smile widened, a rare expression of genuine satisfaction. "That's the spirit, Father Michael. Together, we'll make sure your story reaches those who need to hear it." The conversation shifted to logistics, Trump outlining his vision for how Michael's story could be told, through interviews, community outreach, even a foundation to support former clergy who had fallen on hard times. Michael listened, his initial hesitation giving way to a cautious optimism. For the first time in years, he felt like his life might have purpose again. As the morning wore on, the pale winter light streaming through the window grew brighter, illuminating the room with a soft glow. Michael glanced outside, watching as the city continued its relentless pace. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like he belonged. And for the first time in years, he dared to hope. Several days after their last meeting, Trump and Father Michael sat across from each other in the same small hotel room where their conversations had first begun. This time, Trump carried a large envelope, its contents visible only through the slight bulge it created against the manila paper. He placed it on the table between them and slid it toward Michael. "There's a significant amount of money in here," Trump said, leaning back in his chair. His voice was measured, but carried a weight of intention. "You can use it however you see fit. No strings attached. Make your decision wisely." Father Michael's hands hovered over the envelope before finally picking it up. He weighed it in his hands, not just physically, but spiritually. His mind raced as he thought about what this money could mean. A better place to live. New clothes to replace his threadbare wardrobe. 3 meals a day instead of wondering where the next would come from. Yet, as those thoughts passed through his mind, another, more pressing realization took hold. Money wasn't his savior. Faith was. Over the next few days, Michael made his decision. He walked the streets of Manhattan, seeking out the homeless, the hungry, and the downtrodden. In his hands, the envelope became a lifeline, not for himself, but for those who had even less than he did. Every dollar went to buying meals, blankets, and warm clothing for the city's most vulnerable. By the end of the week, the envelope was empty, its contents transformed into tangible acts of kindness. When Trump met him again, his expression was unreadable as he asked, "Why didn't you keep any for yourself? You could have used it to rebuild your own life." Michael's response was simple but profound. "Money is just a tool, not the goal. If God has blessed me with this, then it's my duty to use it in a way that glorifies Him." Trump, standing by the window and watching the city below, allowed a small, satisfied smile to cross his face. Michael's actions had passed the first test. Not long after, Trump approached Father Michael with another opportunity. This time, it wasn't an envelope, but a key. It gleamed in his palm as he handed it to Michael. "This is for you," Trump said. "A small house, fully furnished. It's a place where you can live comfortably and focus on your mission without worrying about survival." Michael hesitated, but ultimately accepted. When he arrived at the house, he found it just as Trump had described. Cozy, clean, and inviting, the house had everything Michael needed: a warm bed, a stocked kitchen, and even a small study where he could read and pray in peace. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of stability. He began to think about how he could use this space to help others, perhaps as a temporary shelter for those in need. That chance came sooner than he expected. A few days later, there was a knock at the door. When Michael opened it, he found a small group of men and women, their faces weathered and worn by the streets. Their clothes were thin, their breaths visible in the frigid air. "We heard you might be able to help," one of them said, his voice shaking. "We're cold, hungry. We've got nowhere else to go." Michael didn't hesitate. He stepped aside, inviting them in. "Come in, warm yourselves," he said, already moving to the kitchen to prepare what little food he had. Over the next few days, Michael shared everything he could with the group: his food, his blankets, even his bed. As the house filled with life, laughter, and prayer, Michael began to consider whether he even needed the space for himself. One evening, as they gathered around the small table for a simple meal, Michael addressed the group. "If this house can save more lives, then this is where it belongs," he said, his voice steady but resolute. "A priest needs nothing more than love and faith. I can find shelter elsewhere." Unbeknownst to Michael, Trump was observing the entire time. Watching from a distance, he nodded approvingly. Michael's willingness to put others first, even at great personal cost, had proven his character yet again. The final test was the most challenging, designed to test not just Michael's faith, but his humility and devotion to his mission. Trump orchestrated a meeting, inviting Michael to a high-rise office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The room was filled with wealthy and powerful individuals, each of them carefully selected to play their part in what would be Michael's ultimate trial. Michael entered the room quietly, his simple presence a stark contrast to the opulence around him. Leather chairs, polished oak tables, and the faint aroma of expensive cigars filled the space. The men and women gathered there were dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses, their polished smiles masking a quiet intensity. One of them, a sharp-eyed man with a silver tie, leaned forward. "Father Michael," he began, his tone smooth and persuasive, "we've heard about your incredible work. Your compassion and faith inspire us, and we believe you deserve more recognition and more resources." Michael listened silently, his hands resting on the arms of the chair. "We want to offer you a position," the man continued. "Become our personal priest. Minister to us, guide us spiritually, and in return, we'll provide you with a financial grant so large you'll never have to worry about money again. You'll live comfortably, with every resource you need to continue your work." The room fell silent, all eyes on Michael. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze drifting to the window. Beyond the glass, the city sprawled out, a tapestry of lights and lives. Finally, he turned back to the group. "A priest does not serve individuals," he said quietly, "but serves God and his flock. If I were to accept this offer, I would be turning my back on my mission, and on the people who need me most." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I thank you for your generosity, but I cannot accept. My calling is not for comfort or wealth. It is for service." With that, Michael rose from his seat and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Trump appeared, stepping forward to meet him. Placing a hand on Michael's shoulder, Trump smiled. "You've passed all 3 tests," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Your faith, compassion, and humility are truly admirable. You are the light this world needs." Michael met Trump's gaze, his own expression one of quiet gratitude. Though he didn't fully understand the purpose of these trials, he knew in his heart that he had done what was right, and that was enough. The White House was radiant that evening, its historic halls glowing softly under the light of golden chandeliers. Outside, the American flag swayed gently in the crisp winter breeze, a silent testament to the significance of the evening. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Officials, clergy members, and guests from all walks of life filled the grand hall, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation. At the center of it all was Father Michael. Dressed in a simple dark suit, he stood near the entrance, looking around with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. It had been years since he had stood in a place so full of light and life. His shoulders, once bent under the weight of hardship, were straighter now, though a faint hesitation lingered in his steps. The grandeur of the occasion was almost overwhelming. A quiet voice broke his thoughts. "Father Michael, it's time." He turned to see one of Trump's aides gesturing toward the stage. Taking a deep breath, Michael nodded and stepped forward. As he entered the hall, conversations ceased. Slowly, one by one, people rose to their feet. Applause erupted, starting as a ripple and swelling into a wave of thunderous appreciation. Michael froze, momentarily unsure if the applause was truly meant for him. His eyes scanned the crowd and saw tears glistening in the eyes of some, warm smiles on the faces of others. Each step toward the stage felt surreal. The sound of applause, so foreign to him, reverberated in his chest. For years, he had walked streets where no one noticed him, where his presence was just another shadow among many. Now, he was walking toward the center of a grand hall filled with people who were here because of him. The irony wasn't lost on him, and he allowed himself a small, humble smile. On the stage, President Donald Trump stood tall, his expression solemn but warm. As Michael ascended the steps, Trump stepped forward to greet him, shaking his hand firmly. "Welcome, Father Michael," Trump said softly, his voice carrying both respect and admiration. Michael nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Trump turned to the podium, and the hall fell silent. His voice, steady and commanding, filled the room. "Tonight," he began, "we gather not just to honor one man, but to honor the spirit of sacrifice, humility, and unwavering faith that he represents. Father Michael is here, but he stands for so many, priests, pastors, teachers, and servants of faith, who have given everything for others, only to find themselves forgotten in silence. Tonight, we correct that." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Trump continued, his words growing stronger with each sentence. "Father Michael's story is a testament to the power of faith and the strength of the human spirit. When he was given the means to lift himself out of hardship, he chose instead to lift others. When he was offered comfort, he opened his doors to the homeless. When tempted with power and wealth, he chose humility and service. This is the kind of leadership that inspires nations. This is the kind of man we honor tonight." The room erupted into applause again, and Michael, standing beside Trump, felt his face flush. He wasn't used to such attention, but the sincerity in Trump's words resonated deeply. Trump reached for a small box held by an aide and turned back to Michael. "Father Michael, it is my honor to present you with the Presidential Medal of Freedom." The medal, gleaming under the stage lights, was placed around Michael's neck. He looked down at it, his hands trembling slightly as they brushed against the cold metal. It wasn't the weight of the medal that struck him, but the weight of what it represented. For years, he had felt invisible, his sacrifices unnoticed. Now, standing on this stage, he realized that his journey had not been in vain. As the applause subsided, Trump stepped aside and gestured toward a banner being unveiled on the far side of the stage. The words "Light of Faith Fund" were emblazoned across it in bold gold letters. "Tonight," Trump announced, "we are not only honoring Father Michael, but also launching a new initiative, the Light of Faith Fund. This foundation will provide support to clergy and individuals of faith who, like Father Michael, have dedicated their lives to service but have found themselves in need. It is our commitment to ensure that those who serve are never forgotten." The announcement brought the crowd to its feet once more. Tears welled in Michael's eyes as he absorbed the moment. The fund wasn't just a gesture, it was a lifeline for countless others like him, a promise that their sacrifices would not go unnoticed. When the applause finally died down, Trump turned back to Michael. "Father Michael," he said, his voice softer now, "you are no longer just a man who served quietly in the shadows. Tonight, you are a symbol, a beacon of hope and renewal. You remind us that even in our darkest moments, faith and compassion can light the way." Michael stepped forward, his hands gripping the edges of the podium as he addressed the crowd. His voice, though soft, carried a conviction that silenced the room. "I never thought I'd stand in a place like this," he began. "For years, I believed my work was done in silence, and that silence was its reward. But tonight, I see something greater. I see that our stories, our struggles and triumphs are not just our own. They belong to everyone who hears them and finds hope." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This medal, this foundation, they are not for me. They are for the countless others who have walked the same path. Let this be a reminder that no act of kindness, no moment of sacrifice is ever truly forgotten." The room erupted into applause once more, and this time Michael allowed himself to smile fully. As he stood there, surrounded by light and warmth, he felt a profound sense of purpose. He was no longer a homeless man. He was a symbol of hope and renewal, a reminder that faith could transform even the darkest of journeys into something extraordinary. The days following the ceremony at the White House were unlike anything Father Michael could have imagined. For years, he had lived in shadows, his work unacknowledged and his sacrifices unnoticed. But now, his name was spoken with reverence, his story shared across the country. At first, the attention felt overwhelming. He wasn't used to the bright lights of cameras or the crowds hanging on his every word. Yet, he soon realized this was no longer just about him. His story had become a beacon of hope for others. Michael's first public event took place in a modest community center on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. The organizers had expected a small turnout, but by the time Michael stepped up to the microphone, the hall was overflowing. People from all walks of life had gathered: priests, pastors, nuns, social workers, and even those who had once called the streets home. The air buzzed with anticipation as Michael, clutching a folded piece of paper in his hands, cleared his throat nervously. He began hesitantly, his voice soft but steady. "I'm not a man used to speaking in front of so many. For years, my life was one of quiet service and, later, quiet suffering. I thought my story didn't matter, that it was just one among countless others, lost in the noise of the world. But I see now that every story matters, because every story carries a lesson." As he spoke, the room grew still. Michael shared the details of his life, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a testament to resilience and faith. He spoke of his years as a priest, the joy of guiding his congregation, and the heartbreak of losing his church. He described the cold nights on the streets, the moments of despair when he questioned his purpose, and the small silver cross he clung to as a reminder of God's presence. "Faith is not always easy," he said, his voice growing stronger. "It's not something you carry only when times are good. Faith is what you hold on to when everything else has been stripped away. And sometimes, it's faith in the kindness of others that reminds us of the kindness of God. By the time Michael finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Applause erupted, but more than that, there was a renewed energy among those gathered, a sense of purpose rekindled. Word of Michael's story spread quickly, carried by news outlets and shared across social media. The Light of Faith Fund became a rallying point for communities across the country. Donations poured in, not just from the wealthy, but from everyday people who saw in Michael's story a reflection of their own struggles or the struggles of someone they loved. The fund quickly evolved from an abstract idea into a tangible force for change. Shelters were built, programs were launched, and grants were given to clergy members and social workers who had fallen on hard times. Michael became more than just the face of the fund. He became its heart. He insisted on meeting the people it helped, sitting with them, listening to their stories, and reminding them that their worth wasn't defined by their circumstances. One evening, as Michael visited a shelter funded by the initiative, he met a young woman named Rachel. She had been a Sunday school teacher until a series of personal tragedies left her without a home. When she saw Michael, her eyes filled with tears. "I read about you," she said. "I thought, if someone like you could find hope again, maybe I can too." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Rachel. The fact that you're here, willing to start again, is proof of your strength. And remember, God hasn't forgotten you." These interactions became the cornerstone of Michael's mission. It wasn't just about raising funds or speaking at events. It was about being present for those in need, showing them that someone cared. Each night, after a long day of meetings and events, Michael would return to his small but comfortable home. On the wall above his desk hung the silver cross he had carried with him through the darkest times. Its edges were worn, the metal dulled by years of wear, but to Michael, it remained a symbol of unyielding faith. He often found himself staring at it, replaying the moment that had changed his life, that cold winter day in the alley when a stranger extended a hand and reminded him that he wasn't invisible. Now, it was his turn to extend that hand to others. And with each person he helped, each life he touched, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Michael's story didn't just change individual lives, it ignited something larger. Churches that had been struggling to keep their doors open found new energy. Communities that had grown cynical about faith and service began to see their potential for transformation. Even people who had never considered the struggles of clergy and social workers began to recognize their importance. In a televised interview, Michael was asked how it felt to go from being homeless to becoming a national figure of hope. "I never thought of myself as a symbol," he said. "I'm just a man who was given a second chance. But if my story can remind even one person that they're not alone, then it's worth it." Faith isn't about grand gestures. It's about small acts of kindness that ripple out in ways we may never see. As months turned into years, Michael's mission continued to grow. He traveled across the country, speaking at churches, universities, and community centers. He became a mentor to younger clergy, sharing the lessons he had learned not only from his years of service, but also from his time on the streets. Yet, through it all, Michael remained humble. He often reminded those who praised him that he was just one man among many, that the real heroes were the countless unsung individuals who continued to serve quietly, expecting nothing in return. And every night, before he went to bed, Michael would kneel by his desk, his eyes fixed on the silver cross. "Thank you," he would whisper, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for showing me that even in the darkest moments, there is always light." His story became more than a tale of redemption. It became a movement, a call to action for a world that had too often forgotten its most selfless servants. Michael's journey reminded everyone that faith, when coupled with compassion and resilience, could transform even the coldest winters into seasons of hope. The evening was cool, the air carrying the faint scent of rain, as Father Michael stepped onto the small stage. The venue wasn't grand, just a community hall filled with folding chairs and modest lighting, but it felt sacred in its simplicity. The audience, a mix of familiar faces and strangers, sat in attentive silence. Some had traveled hours to be there, drawn by Michael's reputation, while others had wandered in with little expectation, seeking comfort or clarity. Michael adjusted the microphone, the faint feedback breaking the stillness. His silver cross, hanging just below his collar, glinted faintly under the warm lights. He began not with a grand proclamation, but with a simple pause, his eyes scanning the room. His gaze lingered on the faces of young and old, the hopeful and the weary. He wasn't just looking at them. He was seeing them. "I was once lost," Michael began, his voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of a truth that resonated deeply. Not just without a home, but without hope. There were days when I didn't know if I would see tomorrow. Nights when the cold wasn't just outside, but within me, chilling my very soul. His words settled over the room like a blanket, inviting everyone into his story. Some nodded, others dabbed at their eyes, and a few leaned forward, drawn in by the raw honesty of his confession. "But then," Michael continued, his voice gaining strength, "a stranger extended a hand. It was simple, just a hand reaching out, but it was enough. It reminded me that even in our darkest moments, there's a light waiting to guide us back. We just have to have the courage to see it." Michael stepped away from the podium, walking to the edge of the stage. He wanted to close the gap between himself and those listening, to make his words feel as personal as the story itself. "This," he said, gesturing to himself, "is not a story about me. It's a story about us. It's about what happens when we look beyond ourselves, when we reach out to someone who's fallen, and we say, 'I see you, I care about you, you matter.' That's the power we all have, whether we realize it or not." Michael's journey hadn't just changed his own life, it had ignited a movement. He shared anecdotes of the people he had met along the way. Rachel, the former Sunday school teacher who now ran a shelter. John, the ex-Marine who had rebuilt his life and now volunteered to help others. And Maria, a single mother who had found hope through the support of the Light of Faith Fund. "These aren't extraordinary people," Michael said, his voice breaking slightly. "They're ordinary people like you and me who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. And all it took was someone believing in them, giving them a chance for their lives to change." He returned to the podium and looked down at the folded notes he had brought. Then, with a quiet smile, he set them aside. "I don't need these," he said, earning a soft chuckle from the audience. "Because tonight isn't about rehearsed words or polished speeches. It's about the truth." Michael leaned forward, gripping the edges of the podium. "We live in a world that moves too fast, a world that often looks past the struggling, the forgotten. But let me tell you this, every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to ripple outward. A meal shared, a warm bed offered, even a simple smile. These things matter. They change lives." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You don't need to be wealthy or powerful to make a difference. You just need to care. And let me tell you, the reward isn't in recognition or applause. It's in knowing that you've helped another person find their way back to the light." Michael stepped back from the microphone, his eyes scanning the room once more. "I see so much light in this room," he said softly. "Imagine what we can do if we carry it out into the world." As the audience rose to their feet, the applause wasn't the raucous kind meant to fill a void. It was heartfelt, a steady rhythm that spoke of lives touched and hearts moved. Some hugged the person next to them, others stood in quiet reflection. In that moment, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in years: complete peace. Not because he had found answers to all of life's questions, but because he had embraced his role in helping others seek their own. Father Michael's story became more than just an inspirational tale. It became a call to action. It reminded everyone who heard it that no matter how insignificant we might feel, we have the power to change the world in small but meaningful ways. Faith, kindness, and humility had not only rebuilt Michael's life, but had sparked a movement of compassion and community. His journey stood as a shining example of what happens when we slow down, notice those around us, and choose to care. As he knelt by his bed that night, Michael glanced at the silver cross on the wall. Its worn edges reflected the faint moonlight, a quiet reminder of his darkest days and the light that had brought him through. "Thank you," he whispered, his words meant for both the divine and the countless people who had shown him kindness. Michael's life had come full circle, but it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, not just for him, but for the countless lives his story would continue to touch. Let us carry forward his message. Be the light in someone's darkness. Share your strength, and never underestimate the power of a simple act of compassion to change the world.